Welcome, everybody. It's really such a pleasure to see all these faces and icons of friends and colleagues from all over. So we're really excited to have Libby or Elizabeth Otto here with us. And I'm here, my name is Paul Lerner. I teach in the history department and I'm the director of the Max Kade Institute. And we partnered with the Department of Art History to sponsor this event. And I'm really delighted to have you here. We're going to be hearing about Haunted Bauhaus, gender, sexuality, and politics. And I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Megan Luke, professor of art history, to take things from here, to introduce our speaker and to moderate. So thank you very much, Megan.
Thank you, Paul. And I really want to also acknowledge the generous support that the Art History Department and the Max Kade Institute for German, Austrian, and Swiss Studies, or Austrian, German, Swiss Studies, for this event. It's such a joy to welcome Elizabeth Libby Otto here. I've been following Libby's work for a long time, and it's just absolutely formative. And I've been very excited to teach the book that she's going to be talking about today with the undergraduate seminar in art history that I'm teaching called the Bauhaus Century, which was an effort to contend with the plethora of new research, much of which spearheaded by Professor Otto herself on the occasion of the centenary of the Bauhaus's founding in 1919. I'm going to introduce Libby and then just do a little housekeeping in terms of the Q&A and then turn the floor over to her. Elizabeth Otto is professor of art history and visual studies at the University of Buffalo, where she teaches courses in modern European and US American art and visual culture. She's a specialist in the history of photography, film, and media culture with a focus on questions of gender, sexuality, politics, and labor. She received her PhD in the history of art from the University of Michigan, her MA in art history from Queen's University in Canada, and her BA also in art history at Oberlin College. Professor Otto recently published Haunted Bauhaus, Occult Spirituality, Gender Fluidity, Queer Identities, and Radical Politics with MIT Press in 2019. I can't recommend this book enough. It really walks this incredibly fine line between public-facing scholarship that is incredibly rigorous, right? It's the kind of thing that you can, it makes for a fantastic introduction to the Bauhaus, but also an incredible, deepening of one's knowledge of the Bauhaus for the experts too. I don't know how you did it, and it might be something for us to talk about how one engages with such a kind of monumental institution. In the same year that Haunted Bauhaus appeared, she also published with Patrick Rosler the edited anthologies Bauhaus Women and Bauhaus Bodies, Gender, Sexuality, and Body Culture in Modernism's Legendary Art School, both with Bloomsbury Press. And we read parts of those books in my seminar as well, also excellent. I first came to her work through her activities as a curator, however, with the watershed exhibition Tempo Tempo, the Bauhaus photo montages of Mariana Brandt, from the Bauhaus Archive in Berlin, the Harvard Art Museums, and the ICP in New York in 2005. She expanded this research into Brandt and also the Bauhaus more generally, and also into gender politics in the school, into other exceptional edited volumes, The New Woman International, Representations in Photography and Film from the 1870s through the 1960s, and also a personal favorite of mine, Art and Resistance in Germany. So incredibly active and a very generous citizen, I think, for thinking through ways in which the questions about culture, media in the Weimar period have enormous bearings on so many questions that are germane for our political landscape today. Finally, I just should mention Professor Otto's research has been supported and recognized with a number of major fellowships and prizes from the National Humanities Center, the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. So we're really lucky and honored to have you with us here, Libby, and we're very excited to hear more about both the book and also how it's developing into a new project for you. After Libby speaks, I will be moderating the Q&A. And just because we're a rather large group that's spilling over onto multiple Zoom pages, I would ask that when you ask a question, if you could use the reaction button at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little raise hand emoji. And that way it'll make sure I see you right in the top left corner of my screen, and I'll be moderating the Q&A. So for those of you with questions, we'll be starting there. And I will already admit that I will prioritize those of the Bauhaus seminar. You know, I know that you guys have many questions for Professor Otto, so feel free to raise your hand early. All right, that's it for me. Thank you so much, and take it away, Libby. Please welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for such a kind and generous introduction, Megan. I'm really delighted to be here with you all. I'm going to share my screen. Hang on 1 second. We ran through my slides, so I'm just going to have to back them up, which is the only problem. All right, let me do that again. Okay, sorry for the little delay there. So what I'll be talking to you about today is, as Megan said, Professor Luke, that giving you kind of an overview of Haunted Bauhaus with a specific focus on two of the chapters, one on Bauhaus women and the second on queer Bauhaus members. And at the end, depending on how the time goes, I'll speak a little bit about the final chapter of Haunted Bauhaus is on politics at the school and really focuses on communist Bauhaus members. But while I was working on it, I realized there was this whole other chapter about, or kind of, well, it's going to be my next book, that is about Bauhaus members who stayed in Nazi Germany. So I'll speak a bit about that at the end. And I look forward to your questions when I've done all that. So away we go. All right, so just as an overview, the Bauhaus is remembered in a complicated number of ways that often contradict each other. I think after this last centenary year, there's been a lot of new scholarship so that people may have more accurate perceptions of it. But for a long time, it was remembered as an architecture school, even though architecture was only taught there from 1928 on, so well into the existence of this school, which began in 1919. It's also remembered really as kind of, I think it often gets to be the most boring of the modern movements, whereas if surrealism is kind of exciting and you know, interested in sex and dreams and all of those kind of interesting aspects of the human psyche, then the Bauhaus is remembered sort of for pared down lines, good design, but, you know, kind of a little stale and boring. So as Professor Luke indicated, I was in the archives because I was working on Marianne Brandt, working a lot at the Bauhaus archive in Berlin, and just started to see materials that didn't make any sense with what I had learned about the Bauhaus. So I spent really a lot of years just looking at as much material as I could and working with other scholars, as she indicated, especially Patrick Rossler, but a number of people, in order to kind of figure out another way of telling the Bauhaus story than just rational modernism. So here I show you a few iconic images of the of what Bauhaus design is. The Bauhaus building designed by architect Walter Gropius in the top left, the Vasily chair by Marcel Breuer, which is still in production today or in production again, and a tiny tea extract pot by Marianne Brandt. And especially this image on your lower left, I think is kind of an iconic Bauhaus object. And one such tea extract pot actually still holds the record price for a Bauhaus object sold at auction. And yet Marianne Brandt's name is routinely left out of histories of the Bauhaus, as are most women. So these are those two other books that kind of helped give me a lot of background in thinking about how women in particular fit into the institution. So on the left is an edited volume which contains essays by 14 scholars thinking about especially gender, a little bit about sexuality, but really gender and women at the Bauhaus. And on the right is the book that I wrote together with Patrick Hossler that profiles 45 Bauhaus women that we thought everyone should know about. So in one of these books, two of the contributors, Patrick Hossler and Anke Blum, made this graph because they have access through a German government funded program that they put together to a huge amount of data about what Bauhaus members were doing when they were there. There'd been kind of a truism in the small but important amount of feminist literature on the Bauhaus that women were pushed into the weaving workshop. And that was something that was coming up in a lot of short articles in the school newspaper, for example, written by female students. But if you look at the numbers, and I think this is just really important for our understanding of the institution, what these are showing, the black bars are numbers of female students in each workshop or program in the Bauhaus. And in fact, we see women were in every single one of them. So weaving, this is the one for which women are remembered. It was even called briefly the women's class. That's certainly where quite a lot of women went. But it's less than a third of them. And they were also in architecture, which is remembered as exclusively a domain of men. So I just want you to have this in mind when we're thinking about this. I think this is another case in history and especially art history where an institution certainly had bias against women, but I think the histories we've told of it have kind of sort of sealed over any possibility of understanding what women meant to the institution. So that's kind of an important through line in my work in general and in this book. So I will just proceed now to give you a bit of an overview of the book, and I'll go into more depth as I indicated in a couple of the chapters. So the first chapter that I wrote is called Bauhaus Spirits. And I would say in general, a guiding structural text for my thinking in this book has to do with, the ghostly, the spiritual, that's called Haunted Bauhaus. And that's using I was using Avery Gordon's book, Ghostly Matters. And she's in the discipline of sociology, but she talks about how we can think of haunting as a way of calling attention to, when we do history, when we look at cultural objects, to figures who may kind of be lurking in the margins, almost asking for to come out. So that's kind of one of the things that is a through line in this book. This first chapter focuses on spirituality at the Bauhaus. There was quite a lot of spiritual experimentation and very much against just a pure rationality. They were much more interested early on, but also throughout the years of the Bauhaus, in things like how movement affected creativity, how they were practicing for a number of years a new religion called Mazdaznan that was kind of a mixture of Zoroastrianism, spiritualism, and theosophy. And these elements of a kind of spiritual Bauhaus persist even in later iterations as the school shifts, as it did over time, from being very expressionist during its early phases to becoming more of a constructivist institution. The second chapter, I looked at Bauhaus masculinities in particular, and a number of scholars have pointed to the fact that in the wake of World War I, artists were in Europe were interested in recreating what it is to be an artist and what the role of the artist in society is. And the figure that these artists seem to come up with and embody and then use as kind of a model of both the self and how they're creating in their work is one I call the artist constructor. So on the left, you can see Laszlo Moholy-Nagy kind of embodying this. But what also struck me looking at Bauhaus members' work is how they create these figures and they're doing this kind of work influenced by technology or ideas about technology, creating work that's maybe more experiential than something that could hang on the wall and be sold, although they're doing that too. Even as they're engaging this kind of artist constructor figure that you can see on the left, they're undercutting it in images like the one on the right, where Laszlo Moholy-Nagy takes this photograph of himself that was created by his wife, Lucia Moholy, and reverses it, negates it, cuts off its feet and adds dainty female feet and shows it as incredibly flawed. So I see this as a kind of almost preventive measure to keep, to sort of avoid an overly militant or too competent of a masculinity, because parallel to this at the same time, we see the rise of some of the same kinds of masculine figures in fascist circles that will really be glorified under the Nazi regime. Okay, so I should say that's just something very brief about each of those first two chapters. I'd be happy to say more on the question and answer if you'd like to say more, but I had to, if you'd like to know more, I had to pick and choose a little bit to navigate the time. So I'm going to talk more about chapter 3 here, which is called Bauhaus Femininity and Transformation. And because I had this background kind of my own personal mental Bauhaus archive, that was peopled or filled with the work of women as much as it was men, I didn't want to write a chapter saying, hey, there were women at the Bauhaus. And what struck me is that while many Bauhaus members were multi-talented, they were really trained to think in terms of problems and find a solution for those rather than just only specializing in a medium, although they did certainly do that. You saw the workshop structure in that chart that I showed you. So what seemed to me to be a particular specialty, though, of Bauhaus women was creating kind of modular, transformable design, and then the vicissitudes of their lives that happened during and after the period that they were in the Bauhaus seemed to kind of almost call up this need to respond to the times, to transform, and to kind of start again. So I begin the chapter with this page from the prominent design journal in Germany, Die Form, that shows published drawings and text by Ray Suppot, who was a Bauhaus member during its early years, for several years actually. And she, like many Bauhaus women and many women in general, when we're doing history, has the situation that she had several names. So that's kind of an extra burden when one is trying to find women in archives or books or publications. So she came to the Bauhaus named Anna Niemeyer, but for the longest period of her life, she was named Ray Suppot. So I sort of collect that identity under this name. So what you see here is what she called the transformation dress. And this is just an extract from her text that accompanied it. She said, a dress is not there for its own sake, but to be worn. Today, 90% of all women work, and these 90% need rational clothing. And so she creates this dress that is a basic sheath and that comes ready with a certain number of accessories or jackets so that it can be transformed, in this case, into up to 13 outfits that will serve the working woman, allow her to go out directly in the evening. And even in one version she did of this that had culottes, she was a pioneer of the culottes, they could go directly from work and then be away for the weekend with only a small handbag. Ray Suppot trained as a weaver at the Bauhaus, but she then worked with the pioneering film, abstract film maker Viking Egeling in Berlin. She helped him finish his Symphonie Diagonale, and then became a photographer and worked together with her later husband, Philippe Soupeau, the surrealist poet and journalist, to make photographs on their trips all over Europe, and including Spain on the eve of the Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, and then in North Africa when they were in exile in the 1940s. This is one of those photographs. And one photograph that particularly struck me was after they had to flee Tunis with advancing Nazi forces kind of hot on their tail. And she had to leave all of her photographic equipment and negatives behind because, especially having a camera on her person, had they been caught by Nazi authorities, would have meant likely that she would have been shot on the spot. So she had nothing, and they go to North America, where Philippe is working to set up a network for journalism with the French resistance. And in the midst of all this, Ré Soupeau makes this self-portrait where she is at a fair. This is actually the photographer Giselle Freund behind her. And, you know, it looks like she's kind of aiming at the viewer, that she's armed and dangerous. But in fact, this is was a game where if you shot a bullseye, it took your portrait. And so, you know, once again, she was briefly a photographer through this kind of adaptability. So then I take this idea through a number of artists, and I'll just show you some of their work a little bit more briefly. This is collaborative work by Friedel Dicker Brandeis, also known as Friedel Dicker, together with another Bauhaus member, Franz Singer. They were both Austrian. Friedel Dicker was a very multi-talented artist who already studied with the Bauhaus teacher Johannes Itten in Austria, and was part of the group he brought to the Bauhaus when he went to teach there in 1919. She studied bookbinding, weaving, of course, but also theater set design, and made street puppets, and or did street puppetry with puppets of her own making. When she left the Bauhaus, she and Franz Singer set up their own design studio in Vienna, and they made these toys as one of their designs. Apparently, they did not make a lot of money with their designs in general, but they made really interesting stuff, which are basically a little bit like Lego, long before Lego was made, where you can make different animals or you can make whatever you want out of it. They also, in their interior design, they did architecture as well, were quite specialized in making urban spaces that could transform themselves and serve multiple purposes. So here's a guest room in a guest house in the center of Vienna, that by day above, and then by night with a bed that retracts out, and you could even leave your book on the night table. She became radicalized as, like many Bauhaus members, like many people did, as Europe went through the Great Depression starting in 1929, and the real rise of fascism, but also of communism. And she actually became a communist member, which required paying dues and was less common for a woman to do, but she did. She left the design studio and dedicated herself to politics and made photo montages. None of them survived, but because she was so multi-talented, she knew how to take photographs. So before she destroyed them, she took photos, and this is how we know what they look like. It's also why this one has this big split in the middle of it, because it was too large for her to photograph just with a single image, or she chose to take them closer in. She destroyed her photo montages because she had been arrested for creating false documents to help smuggle refugees out of the country. to safety or political activists. And she knew that these would be very incriminating. And I'll talk about her maybe again a little bit in the end, because she's someone who is figuring in my current project, because what she ultimately did is she was, as a Jewish woman, she was forced to go to Theresienstadt ghetto and concentration camp, where quite a number of intellectuals and artists and musicians were, and there was a fairly vibrant cultural life. And she, even though she had to go there, once she found out that she was to go, she really seemed to feel a calling and packed her bags only with art supplies. And so whenever you see art by children in Theresienstadt, that there's a significant collection in Prague, those were her students. So, you know, we hear about the Bauhaus in you know, people who came to this country, or in Japan, there were a few Bauhaus members, but we don't think of it as a kind of form of art therapy operating in a concentration camp. So incorporating women back into the story allows us to tell really very different stories about what Bauhaus means and where it went. In this chapter, I talk about several other women, and I'm just going to briefly mention Gertrude Arndt, who trained as an architect and was convinced to go into the weaving workshop in the Bauhaus. She was considered their best colorist. This was a very collaborative and cooperative workshop, and the women went to other places to acquire skills in certain kinds of weaving or dyeing, that kind of thing. And then they brought them back and shared them, but it also allowed them to acquire certain skills. So she was very good at it, but in 1926, she sat for her journeyman's test from the guild so that she could be certified within the guild system as a weaver. And she passed it, but she decided that day she would never weave again, that she did not want to be doing that. And that was the end of it. A few years later, she returned to the Bauhaus as the wife of someone who was teaching there. Her former classmate, Alfred Arndt, had been hired to teach architecture there. So she came back to the school and could very easily have gone into the weaving workshop to teach, to help produce some of the orders that they had. But she decided not to, and instead she set up a camera in a basement room in the nice master's house that was a part of that Dessau campus. There were houses specifically designed by Walter Gropius for the masters and their families. And she made these photographs of herself where she's kind of surrounded by fabric, almost sometimes seeming to drown in it a little bit. And yet she is, you know, the one taking the pictures. She referred to these as photographs of herself as the do nothing. And these became quite interesting to me because they're, I think in a way, a very un-Bauhaus experiment. She made them actually in a Bauhaus building, but they, you know, the whole organization is really oriented towards futurity, towards design that is easy to mass produce. These are most of its public products and the persona of the school. That's what the weaving workshop, for example, was doing. And they were one of the few workshops that actually made money. Instead, Gertrude Arndt kind of embraces this do-nothing persona and rejects her life as a productive member of the Bauhaus. Okay, so chapter 4, which I'll talk about for a little bit, is particularly, I call it Queer Bauhaus. My first published work actually was on the French artist Marie Laurencin and the lesbian imagery in her work. So this has been something, kind of giving voice to the queer aspects of art history has been something I've been interested in for a long time. And because of the intervening years from the 1920s until now, a lot of material has been destroyed and a lot of people's stories weren't told. So some of what I was doing was just looking at images like this. And this is kind of I start each chapter with kind of a signature image to pull out the issues I want to be talking about. And I just was kind of thunderstruck when I saw this in the Bauhaus archive, because this is also a specifically Bauhaus interior. This mounted sink, this structure, this is all a room in the Dessau Bauhaus. Students could have an atelier and live there. And Heinz Loh had one of these. This is a Marcel Breuer designed chair we can see on the side. And it's a very Bauhaus kind of photographic experiment using double exposure. I already showed you a double exposed photograph of a ghostly figure in a chair, to introduce, glass, various materials, and kind of a scene that is both artistic, but still very much not old-fashioned art, which was something Bauhaus artists were interested in creating. And photography allowed them to do that. So in the midst of this Bauhaus setting, with its formal experimentation, there's this image of really quite profound tenderness between men, where the central figure, who's the clearest person in the photograph, he clearly was in both exposures of this photograph, his face is being caressed by another figure who's a little bit more ghostly, who I read as only having been in one of the two exposures of this image. And he's reaching out, maybe there's something in his hand. It's a little bit hard to read, even in the original, but seems to be touching his face. And this man is named Hermann Trinkaus, which means drink up. So it could also be kind of a jokey image, because look, drink up's in a glass, haha. But I think there's something to take very seriously about this kind of present, absent, loving image in this photograph, and the way the figure on the left is sort of both contained and reaching out. Germany at this time had a law called Paragraph 175 that had existed before the Weimar Republic began in 1919 and would exist afterwards, which criminalized male homosexuality. And the main result of this law was a lot of blackmail and suicides. It was really a problem. So it wasn't just repressive, but it was actually sort of, there was a campaign against it at the time, and a lot of mothers recounted, just how horrible it was to watch their sons go through, being threatened and losing family members to this situation. So Magnus Hirschfeld was a pioneering sexologist who created the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, which was the first institute dedicated solely to researching human sexuality from a scientific point of view, rather than, taking on moral structures from religion or culture, to sort of look more descriptively at human sexuality, intersex people, trans people, as we would call them now, and just to sort of celebrate the diversity of human sexuality rather than to be judgmental. So I should say it was against this backdrop that I was particularly interested to say, well, why don't we know about any queer Bauhaus members? There was also a very active female lesbian scene. Female homosexuality was not criminalized in the same way that male homosexuality was, but it was certainly frowned upon and moved somewhat underground. All that said, Berlin was also a center of, of clubs, of newspapers and articles. And this is an advertisement from a famous club, Club Violetta, which was owned and operated by the formidable Lotte Hamm, who you see on the left. And part of what they're advertising here is a Sunday cream puff eating contest, which I think sounds like fun. So let me just go back to this. When I was looking for kind of archival traces, one of the things that I did find was kind of notable absences that allow me to conjecture, but it's sometimes hard to know what they mean. So there was a particular student who applied named Hans Volker, who presented his qualifications in a letter and had had a fair amount of art training, and at that time likely would have been accepted to the Bauhaus based on this background. But we know he was rejected, and there's no note in the files about why. But what the letter does say at the beginning is that since he says, right, here it is. The conclusion of his letter reads thus: since the end of September of this year, and this is in 1920, I have permission from the authorities to wear men's clothes, a permission which I am now using. Signed, Hans Volker, also known as Johanna Volker. So it seems quite plausible that this person who outs himself as a trans man and is not accepted to the Bauhaus may have been, it seems quite likely that he was a victim of discrimination because we don't know otherwise why he wouldn't have been accepted. So, you know, the evidence that I was collecting does not suggest that the Bauhaus was a particularly friendly place for gay and lesbian or, you know, kind of generally searching young people who were interested in questions of sexuality. And yet it was a beacon to young people in Europe and even beyond of a place where things were you know, new ideas were in swing, a lot was being discussed. And in some ways, I think we can even consider the Bauhaus kind of a life reform movement as much as an art movement. So despite the fact that some students perhaps were not admitted if they were deemed to be sexually deviant, or a case like this one where Annemarie Hennings, who was the daughter of the Dadaist Emmy Hennings, had an affair with a woman and when another female student. And when this became known publicly, she left the school. So despite the evidence that it was not a queer-friendly place necessarily, there were a lot of gay and lesbian Bauhaus members. So what I do in the rest of this chapter is kind of look at where they take this, take the Bauhaus movement in their work and how there are kind of queer Bauhaus circles of affiliation that seem to endure beyond the institution. So this is Max Pfeiffer-Wattenpool with his good friend Florence Henry, both known to have been gay or lesbian. And I'll just show you a bit of their work. So Max Pfeiffer-Wattenpool came to the school already in 1919 and was probably some version of out already at the time. And he was given a special permission because he was already an accomplished painter to work in whatever workshops he wanted. And this, by the way, I'm just showing you this. This is the kind of work for which he's remembered. It's not my favorite, but when I started looking in the archives, there's this, which the Bauhaus Archive actually shows interestingly. And in the book, I talk about it because because weaving was coded so heavily as a female activity in the Bauhaus, I talk about this as a form of medium drag, that in a way it sort of coded within Bauhaus circles so that anyone talking about it seems at pains to say, this is the one weaving that he made. But I think it was also kind of a form of gender, a form of medium drag, as I say, that he's kind of allowing himself to cross over. And when I looked further, I started finding photographs like this, which to me point to the very lively drag scene in underground Berlin. So Max Pfeiffer-Wattenpool wrote about these as grotesques. He wrote to his friend, the Bauhaus weaver Gerda Willers, about how I made more grotesques, and they are, how would you say, very, very strange, he writes. And what's interesting too is one of these images, this may be a woman, but it's someone, you know, very much camped up. This turned up in the Alpers Association, Albers Foundation, and the archivists were really confused because they thought it was initially by Josef Alpers, which for those of you who know his work, that would be really quite a story. But I show it to you here to show how broadly these networks extend. And then deep in the archives, when I asked to see all his photography, images like this started coming out that I think are not campy and not coded. It's a straightforward image of desire of a beautiful young Italian man. And in the background here, you can see a bit of a bedstead. So it's clearly, you know, within the space of a bedroom, and a very private and personal image of male homosexual desire. Florence Henry is also, I think she's been talked about too little in my opinion, although Sabina Kriebel just published an article on her in October this past summer. So there is more work, and there's one very good catalog of her photographs from Aperture. She was another you know, really interesting Bauhaus member who went by the school to visit some of her friends and ended up staying and learning photography there. Her photographs are often remembered for their rigor, although even Rosalind Krauss, who to my mind, it was one of the first people, at least in English, to talk seriously about Florence Henry's work. Rosalind Krauss wrote of these two metallic spheres in this placement in this photograph as in a way giving herself, Florence Henry giving herself balls. So there's this kind of phallic aspect to it, testicular aspect to it. But at the same time, I think we can think of this as an image of kind of the difficulty, but also a kind of poetry to trying to capture an elusive lesbian subject, as she does here, because she herself in this self-portrait is both present in the mirror, but absent in the foreground, in the kind of real space of the photograph. She makes similarly disorienting and yet structured photographs of Margareta Schall, who was her lover, a Bauhaus weaver. They lived together for years in Paris. And she makes images of people like Ray Suppot, who made the transformation dress that I showed you before. So these kind of playful, sexualized images circulate among Bauhaus members, but also are made in collaboration with a number of them. Florence Henry was orphaned at a young age and lived from a trust fund. She, to my knowledge, had no financial worries for much of her young life until the Great Depression hit, and she, for a while, was cut off from a lot of her funds. And at that time, she interestingly started to take on students like Giselle Freund, who appeared in the background of a photograph earlier. But she, and also Ilse Bing studied with her. But she also sold photographs, and some of them ended up in as kind of softcore photographs in mainstream journals in Paris, where she was living. So this one was in a magazine that I bought through Aid Books that on the front said 100 very audacious photographs. You know, it was clearly kind of going for people who wanted to see pictures of boobs. But it also had other photographs by avant-garde photographers, including Man Ray and Germaine Kroll. So, you know, again, I make the point that when we follow Bauhaus women, they end up in places that we don't think of as particularly Bauhaus. And lastly, I'll just talk briefly about Margarete Leiteritz, who was made a number of photographs based, paintings like this one that were based on her training with Josef Alpers, but they were also based on her work as an archivist, in a scientific laboratory and library in West Germany. And so this one is called catenary curve. And she takes this graph on the right, and she always kept the graphs for all of them because she was an archivist, I guess. But what you see on the left is this kind of beautiful, kind of almost aching image that reminds me of, you know, if Georgia O'Keeffe was a Bauhaus member, this arching line that goes through space into a little square of darkness that, you know, maybe is eternity or something like that. So I became quite interested in her as a figure. At the Bauhaus, she was one of the main figures involved in the creation of Bauhaus wallpaper, but she also, and she also helped to run the process when it was produced. This was the biggest moneymaker for the Bauhaus and kept it going during the Great Depression. But I also started seeing images that seem to suggest she was, there are a lot of, they're queer images, but I did not also want to, I think it's often when we do queer history, if we look back in history and see someone isn't partnered, we tend to assume that they're queer and closeted. And there wasn't the right evidence to do that. As an archivist, Leiteritz was very clear about what she wanted us to see and what she didn't want us to see about her life. So I think of her as a queer singleton, drawing on Andrea Williams's work, a scholar I met at the National Humanities Center, and using this idea of a singleton as a way of thinking about her work that has kind of images certainly of curiosity about female sexuality, but that's all we know about her. So I'm showing you this image of Psyche and Cupid, not Psyche and Amor, not because it's a Bauhaus image, but just so that you have in your mind what this theme usually looks like. When Leiteritz made a book of this, it showed women cuddling together kind of, or this very powerful image, I think, of a female figure kind of diving off into the unknown. So almost a kind of declaration of her singleton status. She also, during the Nazi period, created images that it was noted in a catalog. These are in color, but they're lost for now. So I only have them in black and white. This was supposedly a story from the 1001 Nights, except I couldn't find the story in the 1001 Nights. There's a related one of the man from Yemen and his 6 beautiful slave girls, but any men in the story who are kind of the framing figures who are both, you know, totally in love with these slave girls have been edited out of the paintings. I'll just conclude by talking about a final Bauhaus member, and then I'll show you just one image from the last chapter. But I want to be sure to have time from for your questions. This is Richard Grune, who was at the Bauhaus for a year. He took the preliminary course, which all students had to take, changed over time, but this was generally a course where students were supposed to get rid of their preconceived ideas about art making and just really try things out and experiment. It was not at all uncommon for them to need to take this course twice, but at the end of his second time, one of the Bauhaus masters named Gertrude Grunau, she said in her report to the other masters that she felt that Richard was somehow blocked, and that when he discovered something about himself that he would become freer as an artist. And we will never know what she meant by this, but it does sound potentially like she was aware of, at least to some extent, the fact that he was in the process of coming out and figuring out his sexuality at a young age. When he left the Bauhaus, he used his graphic design skills for socialist causes. Often he was a committed socialist. And this is a book he put together. He helped children assemble and help them design from a legendary autonomous children's socialist summer camp that happened in 1928. Richard Grune was arrested in 1934 by Nazi authorities. He had been creating an anti-Nazi newspaper and circulating it, which was extremely dangerous. But he was arrested specifically on the charge of having a loud gay party. And from 1934 until the end of World War II in 1934 to 1945, he was in various concentration camps. And he survived, but this was surely an extremely difficult 11 years. And when he came out of a concentration camp, it was a forced march, and he managed to escape in the spring of 1945. He, unlike other victims of the Nazis, he was given no compensation because paragraph 175 was still law in Germany at that time. So he was never given any reparations or support for what he endured. But he did turn back to his art, to lithography, to make a whole series of images of what prisoners endured, what he endured. And this is a complex image because it has elements of homoeroticism, but it also documents a form of torture that was commonly inflicted on non-Jewish prisoners in concentration camps. So I think that by bringing out a queer Bauhaus and thinking about these marginal figures and putting them in the center of the story, we get a much richer story, a much more nuanced story, but to me, a much more compelling story about what was at stake in the Bauhaus. So the very last chapter, I'll just show you. This is it's called Red Bauhaus, Brown Bauhaus, and I look at communist works. This is communist graphic design and agitational propaganda with Bauhaus fonts in the middle of the city of Dessau. And I also touch on this issue of Bauhaus members serving the Nazi regime. So, and this, in the Q&A, I could talk more about it, but this little piece of the last book is what I'm working on in a much larger form now in a project called Bauhaus Under National Socialism. So with that, I hope I've given you a bit of an overview of a different kind of Bauhaus, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. I'll stop my share.
Thank you so much, Libby. That was terrific. And like I say, we're just going to open the floor up to questions. Please use the little raise hand icon and the reactions button. And I'm going to do something sometimes unusual for USC talks, is prioritize questions from students. But don't be shy about also adding questions in the chat. And I'm happy to share those with Libby. So why don't we just get started? Please raise your hand if you have any questions on your mind. Frances, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for allowing me to be the first. I just wanted to say thank you so much. That was incredibly inspiring, especially as I'm kind of attempting this task right now of perhaps senselessly kind of excavating a moment in art history, the historiography around a moment in art history that's very kind of entrenched. And because of that shared interest, I wanted to ask you a question that is both kind of procedural in terms of the actual execution of the research and also methodological. So I'm wondering how it is that in the research and writing of the book, you balanced taking on this kind of enormous, sweeping reevaluation of this very kind of well-known story, entrenched story of the Bauhaus, while also kind of holding in specificity each of these three categories, loosely being kind of esotericism, the gendered experience of the woman artist, and then the expression of queer sexuality. So how did you kind of attempt both this large sweeping reevaluation while also holding these three categories kind of in their specificity and their kind of discrete historical trajectories. So how that happened in the archival research itself and also in the writing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for that generous question. And I would say, like, go for it with your project that you mentioned. It's worth doing and it's rewarding. I would say it was a very messy process, and I didn't know what I was looking for when I went into the archives. So it was really just looking and gathering and, you know, going to as many archives as I could and seeing as much work as I could. It was also talking to other scholars, like especially that queer Bauhaus chapter. I was at the Bauhaus archive and there was a curator named Klaus Weber who's retired since then, but I said, look, this is what I'm interested in, and I'm seeing, you know, this is the little tiny pile of material I have. Is there anything that occurs to you? And you know, one thing he pointed out, an artist whose nickname was always feminized, and that always struck him as unusual, that when other Bauhaus members were responding to him, and he said, I don't know. So, you know, I didn't end up following up as much on that artist, but I stuck it into the footnotes in case anyone else wants to kind of follow on that thread. So, you know, I think maybe doing as much looking and thinking as you can, talking with friends, other specialists, but also non-specialists, because they often have good questions, is helpful. And then also not holding yourself, you know, with 1,253 members in the institution, I'm never going to be able to tell everyone's story. So, you know, to also be sort of patient with what's possible. And yeah, and I think, you know, Megan mentioned very kindly that the book reads pretty well for a mainstream audience. I recently saw on Amazon, I think someone left a review saying that the introduction was tediously academic, but the rest of it was good, or something like that, which just to me like said, like, oh, good, like someone who's not used to reading academic stuff is reading it. But I think, you know, realizing that I wanted to tell a story to make it worthwhile for, you know, because for a long time in my head, it was large and small piles of stuff that is interesting, but, you know, to bring it together to have more meaning was a process that was really valuable for me. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. And I heard you on new books, and that was when I first got excited. So that was exciting, you know, in this kind of straddling the two spheres. So
that was so fun. I like doing more public facing work with this. So thanks.
Elizabeth and then Joanne.
Hi, I have a question as well about your research. So in your book, Haunted Bauhaus, you uncover a lot of new areas and bring to light many of the forgotten individuals of the Bauhaus, as you just discussed in your presentation, such as women and those who are queer identifying. And obviously information and resources on these groups are not as readily available as information might be for someone like Walter Gropius. So when researching for Haunted Bauhaus, did you find yourself often having to create your own narrative, or try and piece together gray areas of information?
Yeah, I tried to be clear. So for example, that image of Heinz Löw and Hermann Trinkhaus together, you know, I was able to say we don't know their sexualities. Actually, since then, I learned that Hermann Trinkhaus did marry, and I think he also had children, which does not mean that he didn't have a relationship with Heinz Löw. We just don't know. So I tried to be clear about not inventing things, but you know, this has become an even more pressing question for me methodologically in my new book, because I have a chapter on, I'm thinking a lot about someone called Lotte Rothschild is how we say the last name. She was a Bauhaus metal designer. She was in communist student productions, and she was murdered in Auschwitz, and her work is all gone. So, you know, to me, it replicates the violence of Nazism to just leave her out of the story because we don't have work. at the same time, I can't invent work for her, you know, so I have photographs of her in these performances. I'm reading up on what they were because they were collaborative and not very well documented. I have a picture of a storefront window that she might have had a hand in, might not have, you know, so to kind of at least foreground what's gone and how we can access at least gesture to the work that's gone, is something I'm thinking about now. But I always think it's, yeah, it's very important. Saidiya Hartman's Critical Fabulations is what I've been reading and thinking about, and to not you know, to not make things up. We can't do that, even if we'd love to bring someone back as best we could.
Joanne, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful talk. I will preface this by saying that I am not at all in this field. I'm a historian of the Caribbean, whose partner happens to be an artist. So I'm like, interested in art. Okay. So if this question is just totally out of left field, you can just be like, no. But I was thinking about a friend of mine, unrelated to this, Sam Huneke, who wrote an article about queer writers in Weimar Germany. And he talks a lot about how, you know, as much as the medical establishment is talking about suicide, gay writers, gay and lesbian writers are also talking about it a lot, right? And that there's almost this kind of valorization of suicide and death as part of the queer experience in that era. And so, I mean, and because it's called Haunted Bauhaus, I was wondering if there was also a kind of fascination with death or suicide in the work of the queer artists that you looked at. I mean, I thought of that photograph with Trinkhaus, right? There is something like ghostly and deathly about it too, but I was wondering if there were other examples and others that perhaps pointed to this theme of suicide, perhaps. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. No, and it's a great question. Awesome. Don't feel like you can't ask a question if you're not a Bauhaus expert. So suicide, not particularly in this, but you know, an interest in the otherworldly and the dead. There were there traces of the body, like, you know, double photographs that seem to be spirit photographs or something they're doing. There's one drawing that I show of a seance that seems to be at the Bauhaus, and seances were still considered scientific experiments at the time. In 1926 or 27, the one was held again in the Sorbonne, in the university itself in Paris. So there's a real interest in the otherworldly more broadly. You know, the image to me that speaks almost towards something, not quite suicide, but certainly, you know, an almost violent renunciation, are those photographs of Gertrude Arndt, where she stops making fabric and, you know, covers herself, almost sometimes mummified a little bit, as a renunciation of her craft. So, you know, it's not quite suicide, but it's something in that, you know, something kind of ghostly and haunting and a sort of death of a kind, I think, that she seems to be celebrating there. I think I might have just frozen for a second. Yeah, sorry. Could you hear me okay? Okay, good.
Maddie, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this talk. I am wondering, so I'm maybe approaching this from like the opposite side as Joanne, with a very specific question, but I think it's helping me think about larger issues. So I was wondering about the chart that you showed at the beginning of your talk, and some of this might be well answered in the edited volume that you've just put out, but I'm wondering, are the numbers shown cumulative over the course of the Bauhaus, or are they date specific? And I was thinking specifically, I think that Ty Smith says there's sort of this distinction between pre-1921 and after, with the establishment of the women's class. So I'm wondering, one is like factual question, but then I think like with the Bauhaus, there's this very large body of scholarship, of sort of explicitly feminist scholarship dealing with how to represent marginalized voices, and yet always accounting for their being marginalized or them working in sort of the feminine workshops, or the feminized singular weaving workshop. So how, like, what particular pressures did you have in approaching this project from a feminist perspective that's different from how other feminist art historians have discussed the Bauhaus?
Sure, yeah. You know, Ty Smith has done fabulous work. Also, Anya Baumhoff, you know, really does the first groundbreaking work with a feminist perspective on the Bauhaus. So just to answer your technical question about that chart, that is over time, the number of women in the Bauhaus in various workshops, and it breaks down to be 37% of the student body. The first year, there's 51% women, and Gropius, so scholars like Baumhoff, and I think Ty Smith probably says this too, are very critical retroactively of Gropius for the fact that there are these minutes that where they are illegally saying we need to reduce the number of women in the school, or, you know, we could be accused of having a school of dilettantes. I guess in general, in my approach, try less to judge and more to understand. And Gropius's gift, most of his architecture was actually collaborative. I think he was a good architect, but he was a great institution builder. And I think he, you know, people say that the Bauhaus was a child of its time. So, you know, what Gropius, there are institutions that were dominated by women, like say the Letterverein, that were really important, but, you know, nobody's heard of them here, right? For the most part, I'm guessing most audience members haven't heard of the Letterverein. It was all women. So I think Gropius was aware of the fact that if the school was predominantly women, that it might not survive as well. So, you know, I try to describe that more than to say like he was a pig. So consequently, this was, by the way, not legal under Weimar law to make it harder for women to get in than men. But in this meeting in 1920, they decided to do this, and the masters do this. So over time, they actually make it a little bit harder for women to get in. And so at the very end of the school, it's a third women. I think in the Berlin period, it may be even less than that. So, which is just a 6-month period. So, you know, consequently, what we could also say is that the women who were there were particularly well qualified because they had to actually get in under higher, stricter admission standards than the men. And one thing I really noticed that I think in a way speaks well to the Bauhaus is once they were in, they seemed to thrive in a way that they did not once they left the Bauhaus. Often they had a harder time often securing positions. Some of this was during the Nazi period when there was a complicated gender politics of work anyway. But still, even, you know, when they left, they tended not to get as good of jobs. Many of them left the profession or, you know, had trouble with that. I feel like there was one other part to your question. The issue of the women's class sometimes becomes inflated. It was used for a very brief period of time, actually, I think for about a semester around 1921. I'd have to take a look. But, you know, so, and as you saw in the chart, like there were actually 14 men in the weaving workshop. So it was not exclusively all women, and they were certainly not all forced in there. But it was tough. You know, that's women all around report that. There was sexism for sure. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Livy, I'm going to take a brief moderator's prerogative and ask a follow-up to Maddie's question. And it was one that came up in our seminar that I couldn't answer. Several of the students were really intrigued by the presence of working, students of a working class background versus, the class identity of the students. And if there's data about that and where its presence in the archive is, because I know, yes, the numbers according to gender are clear. You've talked about the ways in which sexuality was coded and difficult sometimes to parse, but how did class manifest itself? And were there records if someone is coming from, say, an Arbeiter family,
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can say straight up now, there's no kind of data, because that data set from the German Research Foundation that Patrick Rossler and Anka Blum and a number of other people, Magdalena Drosta, worked on. They were looking really at school records and inputting data on that, like what classes did people take, what were their genders, what were their nationalities, where did they die, where were they born, that kind of thing, which is actually also useful for me to figure out in terms of a diaspora. But social class wasn't generally noted in the record specifically. So the evidence that we have is anecdotal again. And, I can say someone like Friedel Dicker, she was actually the first student who was hired by the Bauhaus masters to teach her fellow students because she was so great, but also because she was from a very poor family and she was on scholarship the entire time. But then there are other students who we know, say Florence Henry, who was there as an auditor, but who were independently wealthy. So it seems to kind of run the gambit. And quite a lot of people who were just kind of from the educated upper middle class. That seems to be quite a lot of them as well.
Thanks. I saw Paul's hand first and then Jessica.
Do you want to let Jessica go before me?
Sure. All right. Let's stick with the students first. Go for it, Jessica.
Thank you. And thank you for being here. Your work has just been so formative in how I approach the Bauhaus and then photo montage in general with your Marianne Brandt book. But I'm really interested to hear more about your current work or your future book project on Bauhaus artists who stayed under National Socialism, and like personally being interested in other artists who stayed and were under innere exil, like Katie Kollwitz or Hannah Hoch. A question that I kind of have had to ponder. So I'm interested in hearing how you kind of square this circle, which is how do you kind of situate the act of them staying is a sort of tacit acceptance of National Socialism with previous or their longer artistic production or political writings. Is it a sort of tacit acceptance of it? And also, how do you approach that subject methodologically, and where is this research kind of going?
Sure, yeah. Megan, I could pull up those slides that I was going to talk about that I didn't have to, but I don't. What do you think? Should I show a couple slides while I talk about this, or just more talk through it? Either way.
Yeah, show some pictures. I think that would be cool. Share,
because I had like basically a whole second presentation, which is what there wasn't really time for, which I knew probably would happen. So I'll just very briefly talk about this project, and then I want to say something before I forget briefly to I think you kind of have two questions about tacit guilt for being there. One of the things that's compelling to me in this new work is its relationship to what I think many of us maybe have felt recently. There was a time in the last years where I wondered when the point was that I would need to leave, given things that my government was doing that I didn't agree with, but felt powerless to stop. So, I try to, when I look back, especially some of these artists, what they did is abhorrent, but, there's someone like Herbert Bayer. I'll show you an example of his work in just a second. Well, let me just go to it now. Oh no, I cut it out of this part. He's not in here. where Herbert Bayer made a few photo montages for this 1936 Germany exhibition, for the booklet that was given out to international visitors who came, that really are glorifying Nazism and Hitler. And this was the job. He was working in the Dorland agency, but when I first saw it, I was really revolted and just thought, like, how could you, you know, and also, why didn't you leave? And I think it's only been, you know, doing this for decades that, you know, I learned, like, well, he was Austrian, so he didn't see himself as implicated necessarily in Nazi Germany. He had a job and a family. So, you know, you're not necessarily going to up and leave. And in fact, as I learned over time, it was difficult to leave. You had to have somewhere to go and you had to have money. So that was difficult. And it was only later that I learned that his wife was Jewish and his daughter was half Jewish. So he was actually under a fair amount of pressure to perform in a way that was not apparent to me from just simply looking at his work and judging. So in this project, what I'm doing is trying to revisit what, you know, so often it happens, I hear it in English and German, there's kind of like, you know, and then the Nazis shut down the Bauhaus in 1933 and they all went away. And some of the most famous ones went away. Perhaps they're famous also partially because they went away. And, you know, Walter Gropius taught at Harvard. There were many influential Bauhaus members here, but in other countries, but the vast majority stayed, and people don't seem to want to talk about that. And I think in a way they want, you know, we want our artists to be brilliant and also politically pure, and they just weren't. So even Gropius submitted drawings. He became a member of the Reich Chamber of Culture. He submitted drawings for competitions like this one, where you see little Nazi swastika flags fluttering in the breeze. So I tell this story the way I'm thinking about it now, which kind of goes back to how do you organize it? After a lot of work, the structure I've come up with is two parts. The first one is kind of Bauhaus elements in society. And the second part is then the Bauhaus in relation to the Holocaust. So the first chapter is focusing on what happens to the Bauhaus building afterwards, because it's this huge building in the middle of Dessau that's really useful, and it gets used as a home ec school and a training school for regional ministers. So here you can see, you know, the swastika and eagle on the Bauhaus building itself. The second chapter looks at Bauhaus design in Nazi homes, in particular that Bauhaus wallpaper, even though the name Bauhaus was somewhat maligned and people love to say, oh, it was always considered degenerate. Well, Bauhaus wallpaper was selling like gangbusters throughout a lot of Nazism. So I think it's quite arguable that it did not only have a negative connotation. And then things like this very minimalist square design were mass produced, designed during the Nazi period, and sold to many homemakers. There are also cases like this. These are two mocha cups designed by Margaret Hemann-Löwenstein, who's someone I've written about a lot. Her factory, very successful ceramics factory, was Aryanized and taken over by Hedwig Bollhagen. That factory is actually still running to this day. And so we end up with things like this, where a kind of, you know, Nazi modern lifestyle is promoted through designs made by a Jewish Bauhaus designer who's had to flee and lost everything of the company she built up. I have a chapter on graphic design and cinema made by Bauhaus members. And this is someone named Petra Pevas, who it's, you know, it's kind of, I actually made this scan myself with my phone yesterday, so it's a little weird looking. It's not that ghostly on the left, but this is an ad for the newsreels, and you can see a kind of expanding Germany on this side here. So even though he ultimately would run into trouble for a film he made that was considered Jewish Bolshevik, he also certainly was trying to make design and participate in this you know, entertainment industry that helped make the Nazi machine and rearmament and war and all of those things kind of possible. You know, propaganda and entertainment were a big part of the Nazi program. This is the woman Lotte Rothschild, who I spoke of before. Here she is in this communist play that was put on at the Bauhaus. And this has been a really interesting part of my research, because what I'm interested in doing is particularly looking at those victims, how we treat those Bauhaus members who were victims of the Holocaust, but also try to recapture some of their work. And she was murdered in Auschwitz with her older daughter, Ruth, but her younger daughter, Catherine, survived, and she's still alive in Paris. So she's been sharing family memoirs and, you know, the fragments that are left. And incidentally, at one point I said recently, so there's nothing at all that, you know, not something that she owned. And she said, when my parents left Paris, they put everything in storage in the basement. And when my father returned, it had been broken open and everything given away because they were seen as Germans. So, you know, enemies of the states, even though one was a Holocaust victim and the other was a resistance fighter. So, you know, the pressure on this material is quite great. And then the last chapter looks at design work by Bauhaus members in concentration camps. Franz Ehrlich was first in a camp in Buchenwald, which is right on the outskirts of Weimar, where the Bauhaus started, because he was a communist, but he ended up designing, you know, plans for expanding the camp, and also Nazi SS officers' houses, like you can see here. So this is, you know, quite un-Bauhaus in some ways, but there is still this rectilinearity, which then shows up in a swastika design. And then the last, the sort of epilogue, because I don't want to leave people in the Holocaust, but also, you know, taking again this point that I often think of, that we can tell different stories about what this movement meant and did. I look at Bauhaus members who particularly turned to care for and foster children through education or through their photography. This is the photographer Edith Tudor Hart, who was working in London, and then I return also to Friedel Dicker, who I talked about before. This is a work by her student, one of her students in Theresienstadt. A student of hers survived, and this was actually a student who she worked with in, she was a young woman. They worked together in Vienna and then in Prague with refugees. So she knew Friedel Dicker's methods. And she's Edith Kramer. She came to the US and became one of the founders of the art therapy movement at NYU, and as a broader movement. She's kind of considered the grandmother of art therapy, although she says Friedel Dicker is. And another of Friedel Dicker's students from Theresienstadt itself became a child psychologist in the US and used some of these methods. So, you know, again, Bauhaus can go kind of different places depending on where we look at it, but you know, I'd say, I'm just going to stop the share. I'd say generally, I'm also interested in kind of taking apart a lot of the structures that I see in place for art history in terms of making kind of geniuses and making marketable kind of commodities out of people's work, I guess. So long answer to your question. I hope I answered it, but that's the new work in a nutshell. And yeah, and that's how I try to deal with people who, you know, yeah, to return to your first question, I feel like I'm not in a position to historically go back and judge people, but I am in a position perhaps to tell their stories and evaluate what they did. So, you know, there was one Bauhaus member whose work I didn't show to you, who was in charge of gas chamber and crematoria construction at Auschwitz. So I don't, you know, I think he's got to be in there, but, you know, I don't want to give him too much attention either, because I think that story should be told, but I also don't think he deserves much recognition, more sort of notoriety.
Paul, do you still have your question? I think there's time.
Yeah, I was worried that we were running out of time, and also I don't want to be anticlimactic, because that's such a powerful note to end on. But maybe, Libby, if I may, first of all, I want to thank you because this was really such a wonderful presentation, and the book is so rich and dense and so fulsome, and you kind of gave us such a concise but still revealing tour through it. So that's a real pleasure. And I guess this is very much a historian's question, and I'm looking around the chat and I see at least a couple of kindred historian spirits here. It's that I'm wondering if you can kind of walk us through briefly, because I guess we're out of time, but just very briefly, some of the broader implications of what you're suggesting here, because you're really, I mean, these are kind of sacred cows about the Bauhaus as a victim of the Nazis. And I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not sure how to leave this presentation and how to reassemble a narrative about how Bauhaus fits into kind of the politics of the arts in 20th century Germany. So if you have any, I know that's hugely broad and impossible, but if you have anything to give us now to kind of like, is there a new, can you kind of help me sleep better tonight? And kind of like where do we go from here? What are the implications?
Well, I guess I could say, like, Bauhaus is all about democracy and freedom and equality, and then we'd all maybe sleep better. I think, to me, I guess I sleep better knowing, realizing that art has no politics, and that you can take an aesthetic or an approach and do a lot with it. And I'm discouraged, I guess, or not discouraged, but I feel it's important to understand the evil that was done with this movement, but then also, this ending piece, right? The sort of great but small everyday goods that it did in Theresienstadt, for children who were traumatized, or for people learning art therapy then in New York after the war. Or just in general, that kind of impulse to teach that is a part of the Bauhaus, and this is a methodology that still is influential in the teaching of art around the world. So I do think it's generally we can still claim a good Bauhaus. I think what upsets me is the way that the kind of art history machine, or especially the market of it, really wants to glorify artists in a way that no one can live up to. I was speaking sometime recently with Patricia Layton, the Picasso scholar, about what a rock star he became, and she said, I think it ruined his life. And I think that that's true of many of the great men that art history loves to make famous. And I'm just much more interested in saying, like, what were all these people doing together? What's the collaboration? What were they aiming at? And I guess, yeah, still telling maybe a messier story, but to me, one that's more satisfying. That's maybe an art historian's answer to a historian's question.
That's a very good answer. I think I don't know if I'll be able to sleep at night, but that's kind of that's for other reasons. As far this, I think you did about as good a job answering the question as could have been done.
You need Xanax rather than Bauhaus, I think.
Thank you so much, Libby, for the remarkable generosity and sharing your work with all of us, for the books that you write, for the way you bring other scholars together. I think this sort of trifecta of the Bauhaus edited volumes and Haunted Bauhaus coming out in 1 year, it's just chapeau, it's amazing. And I think we'll be mining this literature for a long time. So I know everybody here appreciates you taking the time with us. And I'm sure if some of my other students have questions, you'll probably be hearing of them soon. So we're looking forward to having you in LA.
Yeah, great. I'll be out there soon. Yeah, but if people have other questions, my email's on the internet. I'm happy to answer them. Thanks for your collective generosity, for the invite, and it's been really fun. So thank you all.
Thank you.